Hello and welcome to the bonus episode of my Materials for Starters series, in which people that just start Blender learn how to make procedural materials. In this episode we are going to analyze 25 materials that I created, just so you get used to the different techniques used in basic material creation. It would be nice if you followed along and created it on your own based on my explanations so you can practice. Let's start then. First of all, I will hide the copies. As you can see, I had to fill some spaces and it wasn't worth to make a whole new material for places that weren't even seen that much, so I duplicated this thing over there, they won't be lost. Let's start from the beginning. I will upload this file on Google Drive and share it with you guys, but just pay attention because I have an HDRI file which you won't have. It won't be included in the Blender file. It is in the world, so in order to have it you will have to go to HDRI Heaven and get Venice Sunset, or just use LookDev because it's almost the same thing and has its own light. Okay, object, let's start with this one. This is the easiest thing ever. Remember that if you plug color into the base color of an object from the noise texture, you will get all of this rainbow. Well, I just replaced those rainbow things with my own colors, which I put over there, which I can edit. If I don't like this yellow, for example, I can just get rid of it. Or other colors, I can edit this pink into somewhere of red or orange. It's a really basic material, and to make it look some even more natural, I didn't want it to be sharp, so I added a subsurface. This is how it would look like if it didn't have a subsurface, very aggressive. Here with some moderate subsurface it looks more natural. Let's go to the next one. Circular metal. This is just a wave texture, except that it has its origin point somewhere else compared to other cubes that have it in their middle, because I am using a rings way of wave texture which starts from the origin point, and it basically influences the colors, for which I have two of these, and bumps. Without the bump it would look somewhere like this. It is metallic. I changed it in the principal BSDF, and the roughness is on default. The next one is a checker texture. It's really the most basic checker texture you can make, but it looks good. If you added some magic check texture over it on the bump, it would look like some canvas that you put on a table. This is a basic checker texture. I haven't even modified those things except for the color, which I made more red because I didn't want it to be black. And I used the coordinates, the factor of that stuff, to make a color ramp to influence the roughness. So those white things are mirror-like smooth, meanwhile the red part of the material is a bit more rough. The next one is a Voronoi texture, which influences again the roughness and the base color. If I put the color into the base color, I would get this, but the same situation that I used on that noise texture, I wanted my own colors, so I edited them there. Also, because it is 4D, 4D means that a fourth dimension, but pretty much the only thing it adds is this W, which is the root, and it allows you to change the, not root, the seed of your positioning in the world, so you can see a lot of different ways of it being arranged very fast. And it is metallic. The next one is a good demonstration of the mix shader node. It looks very imposing, but it's a really easy material. Those mapping and texture coordinate things will be used very often if you want to work more with materials. They're basically Control T in Node Wrangler. Oops. Let's edit this one because I didn't make any change in it. So if you press on Control T in Node Wrangler, those two will appear, and with those two you can edit the positioning of your vector and the rotation and the scale. So you can make zebra skin like this if you want. Without changing anything on those, they don't change anything on your model, even if they exist. So Blender takes those as granted. Even if they don't exist, they are still calculated. They only make a difference when you modify those things. This is why I modified in the one above it, I modified the Z rotation, the vertical one. So when I mixed those, I basically added them on top of each other and multiplied their colors. When I added those, I wanted them to be on the rotated on 90 degrees to be the opposite of the other one. Well, except from that, it's the same wave texture, except that one has a color ramp with different colors than the other one, just so I could show it a little bit better on how it works. See this green? I didn't set it up. It was a multiplier between this color and this color. So you can make whatever type of shader you want. This value, I just put it in the scale, so I added them at the same time instead of moving them one by one. You can make whatever material you want and plug the principal BSDF or any other node that is a shader with green on the bar. You can plug it into the mix shader node and mix it with another shader. Also, the factor decides whenever I want to lean more on the first shader or the second one. And if it's a radical color, factor, it only calculates one of them. So if I move to 1, the second shader principal BSDF isn't being calculated, and the same way around if I go to 0. This is why this 0.5 is basically an equal mixing of both of those shaders. Very useful node. Okay, this Voronoi, it's really easy to make, just a modification of metallic and roughness, and yeah, I said that you shouldn't keep metallic in the middle, you either have it at 0 or 1, but this looks pretty good if you don't want your materials to look realistic. It has a special something. And it also has a bump node to make those look like shards, which you can also invert, but it doesn't change much. Okay. The next one is just noise textures put into... Oh, I just looked again to understand why I didn't use the same noise texture to get some economy done, but it was because I had different detail scales. So I have one of them especially and primarily for the color. As you can see, I have a blue and a teal color plugged in, and for the bumps I modified them a bit, so I cut from the edge and from the bottom, so it is flat, so it starts and ends flat and is only different on the middle. I don't know, this could be used for mold, I guess, or rust, but I also added a subsurface so it looks like some sort of weird candy. And speaking of candy, the next one is the perfect shader for candy. As you can see, I mixed again bumps with normals and with roughness. This one is plugged into the roughness. The start and the end are again cut like in the previous shader, and the roughness makes the white part pretty diffuse, meanwhile the pink part is very shiny. And the color is pretty easy, again a color ramp plugged into the color with the factory plugged in. We will jump one because this one is basically a modification of this one, and in this shader I will explain the math nodes, the mix RGB. So in this shader over there we mix shaders, but in case we don't really have a shader but we have some color ramps that we want to move around, we use the mix RGB here. We already have one for showcase here, just to prove what they can do. So I changed this one to multiply because I didn't want to mix, I didn't want to blend them the same way that I did there. I wanted them to basically add up on top. But the name changes, so if I didn't add this here, I thought you guys might not know that this is a mix RGB node. What I did, so let's focus on this one. I used the Voronoi texture, except that the randomness is on 0. This is how the default distance Voronoi texture looks like. Meanwhile, if we take off the randomness, it will be this grid of circles and squares. So when I plugged it into the color ramp, I used the constant way of blending to make them sharp instead of that blurry mess that we had before. And I duplicated them into the multiply just to be able to edit the colors. So basically this was around here. It was the same thing that I got from above, but I wanted to move it a bit. So when it multiplies, it creates different colors, and I changed this to a darker green. Earlier it couldn't be seen that great. And of course I put a value node in case I would want to scale this thing. I wouldn't have to move them by myself, both of them. So it moves both at the same time. And I plugged that thing into a color ramp and to a bump node just to make a difference. On this one it can't really be seen, but on that thing, which is basically an upgrade from that shader, it can easily be noticed. I duplicated that thing 2 times more, and I moved this thing, the colors a bit back, so I form those smaller circles. And if I change the yellow, this thing would look a little bit different, like this. But that's not what we want to do here. Again, a value to change the scale, all of them at the same time. And a bump. Okay, the next one is really easy. This is a brick texture. A brick texture is basically this. It creates bricks. Its only weak point is that it can only create bricks on one side. It can't be triplanar, so one side of your object will look like this. So you have to ignore that. I played around with the brick texture over there. I changed the colors, especially for the grid, and I lowered the bias so the colors are quite diverse. So when I plugged it into the color ramp, I set some colors, HSV, which this blue is just to kinda balance everything out. HSV is another type of color scheme, not like RGB. So if we go to the color scheme, oops, I didn't want to change that. We have a red one and a cyan one, and I changed the blending side to near. So since we have 2 points over there, the program calculates in between all the colors between the things that I selected, which creates this cool gradient effect. In the second episode, I think I presented some snow with displacement of a noise texture. This time I added some subsurface to it and some color ramp with blue, so it looks more realistic. Nice and organic. This is a really simple material, even if it looks more complex than even this one. It is a magic texture. I played around with those variables. I made it 4 and duplicated this and made this, halved this part. So after all, it's just a matter of variables. Those are the tools that you can play with. Again, a Voronoi. This can be used in a lot of different ways. In this case, I plugged the distance from distance to edge. By default, it's F1, I think. I don't even know. It can be used for making cracks into ground and stylized materials. In this case, I wanted to make some sort of veins. I can even switch those around. Look at this. And I added some subsurface to make it look more organic. This again, magic texture, except that unlike that one, I added a bump node, and here's a warning about bump nodes on magic textures. They don't really work well together. If I would have to, I had to add a subdivision modifier there, because this happens. The normals don't play along well with the magic texture bump, and bump might have some problems with normals because it doesn't calculate the smooth shading. So if I were to not to subdivide that thing, it would basically look like this in the thumbnail and render and would destroy the whole thing. So in this case, it's not a game model anyway, so I can afford more verts. I subdivided it from the bevel, and it looks a lot more smooth. 6 times. The next one is again a simpler version of the brick texture. I can even make the brick width and height the same, so it's squares, and it's completely black except that the subsurface makes it look purplish. It can be used in stylized dungeon games. The next one is a gradient texture. I really like those things, but they are hard to move around. Again, there are multiple ways of gradients. I just added that thing with a color ramp to edit it out, and a mass grave. If you can see this this grunge around it to make it look dirty. This is a mass grave texture, which is usually used for clouds or stuff like that, or cow marks, which I have over there as well. If you want to edit the gradient, you would basically have to switch the location a little bit. So Control T on that gradient thing, and you can play with the rotation and the location. The next one is the HDRI, just to prove that it can be used as a material. This thing that I used for the light, I could also plug in as a environment texture and plug it into the color, so this thing doesn't really emit light of any kind. I don't have an emissive shader over there, but it acts as a base color, and I also wanted to prove that I can use it as a color ramp to modify the roughness. See, I can play with the grayscale of this image and modify it to my will. So because this is gray, this thing will be diffused, will be rough. Meanwhile, the sky, where it is this white, will be very mirror shiny. It can be observed from here. The next one is again a mass grave texture, as easy as it can get. I think I mistook the colors. It should be like this to be cow-liked. I played with the detail and everything on this thing, on this mass grave texture to reach this this result. It's pretty easy though. You can make it in a few seconds. Okay, this one is a bit more complicated, but because we're getting into maths and multiplication, and in my case, I know that some people might be afraid of this. I'm the same. I'm also afraid of math. Don't be stressed over it. I will explain it to you real fast. Okay, so again, this is a mix RGB. Oh, no, not mix shader. Oops. Mix RGB node. I changed the mix without clamping to multiply, and this is how I got this node. I have two checker textures, and I added this value over there. I can take it off for the time being. So if I look at this thing alone, it is this taxi looking like checker. Meanwhile, this thing is twice as big. I mean, the scale is smaller, but the squares are bigger. And I gave it some orangish color. Those things multiply, so if we look at this, we can change it to one side only. You can see that this shade of greenish yellow is actually a multiplication of black and that yellow shade that reaches to this thing. So we can switch between the things and realize how it was made. Also, those things over there, it's not that easy in this case, because we want this one to always be twice as big in scale as that one, because it's smaller and it should be more dense. I added a math node. Again, the name is confusing. It's not multiply. You add a math and then where was it? And then you switch to multiply, and you multiply that value that you added with 2, which plugs into this, and this one, which is 6, plugs into this. So every single time when you will edit this thing will be twice as dense as this one. And it creates this nice shader. This one is again a wave texture, except that this time I added some distortion. And to the distortion I added some detail, so it has those little dots over there that otherwise it wouldn't have, which I didn't add here, I think. Here, if I added this detail on the candy, it would also have those spots, but they are not needed in that case because it's candy. You can easily make some sort of PewDiePie pattern by that thing if you take the details. And again, the color ramp with the details turned on make this cool grunge for the black part, and the red part is more diffuse. This thing uses a thing called Fresnel, or Fresnel. I don't really know how to pronounce it. Let's test it on a ball. Actually, in real life, everything uses Fresnel. Where did I put it? Here. It adds this sort of realism that calculates the angle from which this object is being watched, and the edges of it are of another color, usually darker, for it to be more realistic. So in this case, you add Fresnel by adding a layer weight with facing. Don't plug in Fresnel. I have no idea for which that is used, but it's very confusing. You plug in a layer weight which calculates the factor from which the colors are calculated for this thing. Also, the hue saturation is a node that allows you to change the basic color and saturation of your colors. So in this case I can just make it green. It's good for color editing really fast without getting in this thing. Also HSV as before for what did I use it for? For this thing. I put it near so it calculates the colors between this point and around this point. Otherwise it would be a blend between those things, and we don't really want that over here. And the roughness, which is a Voronoi texture, I just took off the randomness, otherwise the Manhattan Voronoi would look like this. I wanted it to be squares, so I took off the randomness and added a bump. You can see it on the margins of that thing. So it looks pretty nice. This thing is where I started to use two textures on the same texture. I plugged in the distance of a Voronoi texture, a basic one. I think, yep, a default Voronoi is the same thing as this one. I plugged it into the vector of the wave texture, so the bands that I added in this thing are calculated from the points of the Voronoi, from every single one of those holes of black. So if I edit the scale of those bands, they are basically calculated from those points. I don't have any distortion, but I guess that can be added to give it some specific details. I added it to a color ramp to cut the beginning and the end for the bump and for the color side of it in this thing. And this material has the same technique that I used over there. I used two texture, a noise one and a brick texture. This noise texture that I added over here is basically looks like this. Basically nothing, but this brick texture is calculated from the points of the noise texture, which confused it and made it look from bricks to this weird thing. But we can use it to in our advantage, because thanks to that we can edit it to be really unique and add those cool colors over there. I also made it metallic and added a bump node, which I really exaggerated to make it look really harsh when looked from very far away. This is why it's so black over there. This doesn't really make any sense from a physical point of view, but I can ameliorate it, and it also looks good like this. And the final one is pretty easy. It's a Voronoi texture. I plugged the position into the base color, and that's kinda it. The position is colored in purple because it's a normal map, and normals are usually purple over there. Well, we weren't supposed to add it over there, but if we want some quick detail that looks good, and it looks good, we can use that. Just make sure not to scale it too much in edit mode, because we get this mess and it's really, really terrible. I despise this thing. I hate how it looks like. Okay, this was it. Whew, I talked so much, my throat is sour. I will upload those on Google Drive and put the download link in the description. If you liked what you saw, you can leave a like and a comment. And if you are really generous, I also leave my Ko-fi link in the description. I don't have a Patreon, otherwise I would have added this to my Patreon. I am sharing those materials with you for free. You can support me if you want, so I continue making those courses and tutorials. Thank you for watching. It was Einmeister, and see you next time.